In this presentation, I give a brief introduction to the content of my book on the 1966 Italian-Algerian co-production, The Battle of Algiers. I don't need to argue the importance of this famous and influential film about anti-colonial struggle and national liberation. Most viewers agree that the Battle of Algiers has retained its power, and what I've tried to do in the book is to give a complex account of the sources of the film's power. That said, I have not tried to write a celebratory book about the Battle of Algiers. Celebratory accounts of the film sometimes fall into cliché, distilling the film to Wikipedia-isms about the so-called authentic space of the Casbah, the documentary value of realism, and the refusal of, let's say, Hollywood modes in the use of non-professional actors. In the three central chapters of the book, I take aim at precisely these three clichés. I mean, I also do other things, but in doing so, in taking aim at the cliches, my key exhibit is the coda to the film, when the protagonists of the bulk of the film disappear and are replaced by crowds of extras who reenact popular protests against the French occupation. So in that sense, my book is 130 pages, about 6 minutes of film. The historical Battle of Algiers that took place in 1956-57 was actually a relatively minor affair in the achievement of Algerian independence. But because of the film, this Battle of Algiers has become a lieu de mémoire, a site of memory in which understanding not just of the Algerian independence struggle, but also of anti-colonial struggle as such, has coalesced and is contained. The film's focus on the struggle in Algiers allows a symbolic opposition to be set up between the Casbah and European city, standing for what Frantz Fanon called the colonial world cut in two. However, the presence of the Casbah in the film has been overstated in many accounts, and several of the locations we see in the coda are neither Casbah nor European city. The 1950s housing projects from which the Algerian people emerge as a unity in the coda can then be described as hybrid spaces. And in the chapter, I argue that the film anticipates ideas of third space, familiar from the work of Edward Soya and Homi Bhabha. The hybrid locations shown in the coda speak of how the Battle of Algiers is at once a birth of a nation film and an end of empire film. The in-between interstitial character of the coda and of the locations it contains is precisely what makes the film's celebration of the moment of revolutionary possibility so powerful. The question I ask in this chapter is how a film about the liberation of an African country could be receivable and legible in the colonizing North. The employment of realism by the film was one way of engaging a potentially antagonistic audience. Usually, this aspect of the film is linked to post-Second World War Italian neorealism. But I trace instead the film's debt to cinema of the fascist period in Italy, what Ruth Ben-Ghiat has called Italian fascism's empire cinema. These are films from the 1930s and 40s, made in a choral and realist mode to expedite and celebrate the fascist regime's imperial and colonial projects in Eastern Europe and Africa. In my analysis, I tried to show that the means used by fascist empire cinema to know and to naturalize the colonial scene retains its power to picture post-colonial conditions. Hence, the choral and realist approach of the Battle of Algiers. Now, If this sounds like I'm suggesting that the Battle of Algiers is a kind of Orientalist text, well, I am suggesting just that. But please note that I don't mean this as a criticism. I'm arguing instead for a political cinema that, to adapt Judith Butler, does not represent a pure opposition, a transcendence of contemporary relations of power, but that emerges instead as part of the difficult labour of forging a future from resources inevitably impure. This chapter is concerned with the organisation of time in the Battle of Algiers and with the vision of historical time that emerges from the film. It's the least elegantly formed and clearly argued in the book, but it's my favourite because it seems to me the one that has the richest implications for the discussion of historical cinema. The chapter begins with a description of the complex temporal structure of the Battle of Algiers. I also tried to show that the film captures how the Algerians themselves used time as a rhetorical device. For example, by making a general strike coincide with a key debate at the United Nations. But the bulk of the chapter is devoted to historical reenactment in the film, especially once again in the protests contained in the film's closing minutes. For me, the film reveals how actual historical events were themselves a form of reenactment. What the coda to the Battle of Algiers shows is a self-conscious performance of political and historical agency by the Algerian people. Finally, I tried to demonstrate that the Battle of Algiers is a performative rather than an expressive text. The film doesn't express or illustrate a point or position decided in advance, I argue, but comes to an interpretation of history in the action of its making. And this implies that the crowds of extras seen in the coda and elsewhere in the film are themselves a kind of collective historia, making their own interpretation of history. My book is not intended to be the report of a project of research. It is itself the enactment of an investigation into the sources of the power of the Battle of Algiers. I discovered what I thought about the film by writing the book. I did intend, though, that my account of the sources of the power of the Battle of Algiers should also shed light on the means and capacities of historical and political cinema beyond this individual film, however complex and unique it may be. Hasta mañana.